On the morning of 14 March 1825 in St. James Parish, Louisiana, a memorandum was entered into the bound ledger of the First District Court of the Territory of Orleans, docketed without commentary and signed only with the initials of a junior clerk. The entry was not marked urgent. It did not describe a crime. It did not name a suspect. It recorded, instead, an administrative concern. The memorandum noted a discrepancy between the recorded square footage of the cellar beneath the Holloway Plantation main residence and the measurements taken during a routine inspection ordered after the collapse of a brick retaining wall near the eastern foundation. The difference amounted to less than 4 feet. The clerk described it as an inconsistency requiring clarification prior to insurance valuation. The document remained unremarkable for nearly 30 years. It survives today in the Louisiana State Archives, cataloged among agricultural property disputes, its ink browned, its margins annotated by later hands. It is cited sparingly in the secondary literature, often as a curiosity, sometimes as an error. Yet attached to it, stitched with thread that does not match the binding, are depositions, engineering notes, sworn testimony, plantation inventories, and a series of correspondence that historians continue to debate. Together, these records describe a problem that no court of the early 19th century was equipped to process. They describe space that should not have existed. At the time of the memorandum, the Holloway Plantation occupied approximately 800 acres of low-lying land bordered by cypress swamp to the south and the Mississippi River's eastern levee to the north. The property had been surveyed twice. First in 1809, following its transfer from Spanish to American jurisdiction, and again in 1818 after a boundary dispute with an adjacent sugar estate. Both surveys are preserved. Their measurements are consistent. The ground beneath the main house was assumed to be simple clay and silt, compacted by decades of seasonal flooding and reinforced by shallow brickwork. The cellar, according to building records filed with the parish assessor, measured 22 feet by 18 with a ceiling height of 6 feet, sufficient for food storage and tools. On 3 February 1825, following weeks of unseasonably heavy rain, a portion of the eastern foundation slumped inward. No injuries were reported. The house remained structurally sound. The damage triggered a standard review, overseen not by law enforcement, but by the plantation's insurer, Bayou Mutual Agricultural Assurance, which required verification of subsurface conditions before approving repairs. For this purpose, the insurer retained Edmund Carraway, a civil surveyor recently arrived from Charleston, known for his meticulous adherence to procedure and his skepticism of planter testimony. Carraway's surviving field notebook, now held in the Tulane University Special Collections, contains no commentary, only measurements, angles, soil descriptions, and dates. On 9 February 1825, Carraway descended into the cellar with 2 laborers and a measuring chain. His initial entries confirm the dimensions. On the second page, however, a correction appears. A wall length is crossed out and rewritten. The change is minor, 3 inches. On the following page, another correction appears, this time to floor depth, then another. Carraway requested permission to remove several storage racks along the southern wall of the cellar. According to plantation correspondence, this request was granted without delay. The racks were old, damaged by moisture, and of little value. Behind them, Carraway recorded an irregularity in the brickwork. Not a breach, not a crack, a variance in mortar composition. His notes describe a seam where lime content differed from the surrounding wall, suggesting a later repair or modification. No repair was listed in the plantation's maintenance logs. The logs themselves are exhaustive. Daily entries record tool issuance, meal rations, work assignments, illnesses, and punishments. They were maintained by the overseer, Thomas Ridley, whose handwriting appears throughout the years 1819 to 1826. Ridley's records are consistent, repetitive, and notably devoid of commentary. He did not mention cellar work. Carraway ordered the seam tested. A single brick was removed. Behind it was packed clay, darker than the surrounding soil, compacted by hand rather than water. At this point, the surveyor did not file a report of concern. His notebook indicates only that further measurement was required. He requested additional laborers and returned 2 days later with a plumb line and sounding rod. The rod descended further than expected. By his calculation, at least 8 feet beyond the cellar floor. The possibility of a void beneath the house was not unprecedented in the region. Sinkholes occurred, root caverns collapsed, but Carraway's notes show no signs of collapsed debris. The rod encountered clear air, then resistance consistent with packed earth, then air again. On 13 February 1825, Carraway notified Bayou Mutual. The insurer, following protocol, requested confirmation from a second party. The parish appointed Etienne Fournier, a former military engineer who had worked on levee fortifications after the War of 1812. Fournier's affidavit survives, sworn before a notary on 20 February 1825. It is brief. It confirms Carraway's measurements and adds one observation. The subsurface space appeared linear and intentional. Neither man suggested how such a space could exist beneath an occupied residence without detection. They confined themselves to description. At this stage, the matter remained administrative. The insurer delayed payment. The plantation owner, Jonathan Holloway, filed a complaint alleging undue delay. The court scheduled a hearing for March. It is for this hearing that the 14 March memorandum was prepared. What followed did not occur suddenly. There was no dramatic revelation. The unease enters the record quietly, through routine procedure, strained by facts it could not absorb. Before the hearing, the court ordered a full subsurface inspection to determine liability. This required temporary removal of flooring in the cellar and, under territorial law, the presence of a court-appointed observer. That observer was Samuel Pritchard, a clerk, whose later marginal notes appear in the same ledger as the original memorandum. Pritchard's role was not investigative. He was to record times, actions, and compliance. His notes are methodical. They list the number of boards removed, the dimensions of the opening, the names of enslaved laborers assigned to assist. It is here that a name appears for the first time. Among the laborers listed on 22 March 1825 is Micah, carpenter. No surname is given. In plantation records, enslaved individuals are typically listed by first name and function. Micah appears frequently in Holloway's inventories, assigned to maintenance, repair, and tool oversight. He is described as approximately 35 years old, literate to a limited degree, and physically impaired by a healed fracture of the left wrist. Medical notes kept by the plantation physician, Dr. Alphonse Beauchamp, record the injury in 1816 and note that Micah was reassigned from field labor thereafter. The inspection proceeded over 3 days. Flooring was lifted. Soil was removed in measured increments. The opening widened. By the end of the second day, Fournier recorded the presence of a horizontal passage extending southward beneath the house. Its height averaged 4 feet. Its width varied between 3 and 4. The walls were packed clay, reinforced intermittently with salvaged brick and wood. No tools were found within it, no debris, no marks consistent with recent collapse. The passage showed signs of long-term maintenance. The length could not be determined immediately. The passage extended beyond the reach of lantern light. Measurements were taken in segments. Pritchard's notes record the distance at 36 feet, then 48, then 60. The passage remained straight. At no point in the early documentation does anyone use the word tunnel. The records refer to the subsurface passage, the linear void, or the extended cavity. The language remains technical, restrained. It was only after the third day, when the passage was found to pass directly beneath the dining room floor above, that the court postponed the hearing and ordered the site sealed, pending further instruction. The reason given was structural safety. The reason implied but not written was that the passage should not have been possible. The court order sealing the cellar floor was issued on 24 March 1825, entered into the parish record as a temporary measure pending structural clarification. The language was deliberate. It avoided speculation. It assigned no cause. It did not name responsibility. Nevertheless, the order altered the status of the Holloway plantation. What had begun as an insurance inspection now fell under judicial oversight. Any further work beneath the house required written authorization. Access logs were instituted. Lanterns were counted before and after entry. Measurements were duplicated. The man charged with coordinating these procedures was Samuel Pritchard, the same clerk whose marginal notes would later draw scholarly attention. His handwriting becomes more careful after the sealing order. The entries lengthen. Times are recorded to the quarter hour. Names are listed twice. On 28 March, permission was granted to resume subsurface examination under supervision. The stated objective was limited: determine the passage's length, orientation, and potential threat to the structure above. No attempt was authorized to extend or alter the passage. The inspection team remained unchanged. Carraway handled measurement. Fournier assessed stability. 2 enslaved laborers assisted with lanterns and debris removal. Micah was again listed, his role unchanged: carpenter. The first measured extension brought the total length of the passage to 74 feet. The passage remained straight, its orientation fixed on a south-southeast bearing. Fournier noted that the walls showed no sign of recent excavation. The clay bore the smoothness associated with repeated contact, not collapse. At 91 feet, the ceiling height increased slightly. At 106 feet, the passage widened. The transition was gradual, not abrupt. Measurements suggest intentional planning rather than opportunistic digging. It was here that Carraway recorded the first anomaly he could not reconcile with regional geology. The clay composition changed. Silt content decreased. The soil became denser, more cohesive, inconsistent with flood-deposited layers. He annotated the margin of his notebook with a single phrase: "worked earth." The phrase is not uncommon in survey literature of the period. It denotes soil altered by human action. What made the notation unusual was its location. The passage lay beneath a structure built decades earlier, in ground that should have been untouched since the house's foundation was laid. Carraway measured the depth from the cellar floor to the passage ceiling, 4 feet. From the passage floor to the water table, an additional 3. The margin for error was minimal. Any miscalculation during excavation would have resulted in collapse or flooding. Yet the passage was dry. The lantern smoke drifted forward, not upward. There was airflow, subtle, consistent. Carraway traced it with a strip of cloth tied to a rod. The movement indicated a distant opening, not immediately adjacent, but aligned with the passage's axis. At 123 feet, the inspection halted for the day. Pritchard's notes record that the lanterns were extinguished and counted. All were returned. No tools were left behind. The opening was boarded and sealed again. That evening, Pritchard appended an addendum to his daily log. It is the first time his writing departs from pure procedure. He notes, without commentary, that the passage's direction, if extended, would intersect the southern boundary of the plantation, approximately 200 yards from the main house. The implication is not discussed. The following day, 29th March, Carraway requested authorization to extend measurements beyond the current limit. He cited the need for completion. The court approved the request with a caveat: no excavation beyond what was necessary to determine length. The passage continued. At 150 feet, the walls displayed evidence of reinforcement. Wooden supports, long since decayed, had left impressions in the clay. The spacing between them was regular, approximately every 4 feet. Fournier sketched the impressions in his affidavit. At 187 feet, the passage angled slightly downward, compensating for a rise in surface elevation above. The adjustment was precise. There was no overcorrection. At 204 feet, the passage terminated. Not in collapse, not in an open exit. It ended at a sealed clay wall, compacted more densely than any other section. Fournier's affidavit describes it as intentionally closed. Behind that wall, the sounding rod indicated open space. At this point, the inspection exceeded its mandate. The sealed end suggested purpose beyond drainage or structural anomaly. Pritchard's notes reflect hesitation. The decision to breach the closure was deferred. Before any further action, the court ordered a review of plantation records. If subsurface work of this scale had occurred, it would have required labor, tools, and time. Such activity, if authorized, would appear in logs. Ridley's overseer journals were examined in full. They record no extended absences from assigned labor, no unexplained tool loss, no nocturnal work orders, no injuries consistent with collapse or excavation trauma. Supply inventories were cross-checked. Shovels were accounted for, picks, lantern oil, rope. Nothing was missing. The plantation physician's notes were reviewed. Aside from routine illnesses, they recorded no pattern of injuries consistent with prolonged underground labor. It was during this review that Micah's name began to recur more frequently, not in connection with excavation, but in marginal reassignment notes. Micah, repair door hinge. Micah, inspect flooring. Micah, adjust cellar rack. These entries span years. They describe small, ordinary tasks. Taken individually, they are unremarkable. Taken together, they indicate access. The court requested a summary of Micah's duties. Holloway's response, submitted in writing, described him as a trusted hand, trained in wood and joinery, utilized where care is required. The phrase "trusted hand" appears only once in Holloway's surviving correspondence. On 2 April 1825, authorization was granted to breach the sealed end of the passage. The order specified that the breach was to be minimal and immediately documented. The wall yielded without collapse. The clay behind it had been packed in layers, each compressed before the next was applied. Fournier estimated that the sealing had been performed deliberately and carefully, likely years earlier. Beyond it lay a continuation of the passage, shorter, narrower, and lower. It extended an additional 31 feet before opening into a vertical shaft reinforced with wood remnants embedded in the clay. The shaft rose upward. Measurements placed its terminus beneath a tool shed near the plantation's southern edge. The shed's floor showed signs of repair: newer boards, fresh nails. The repairs were recorded in Ridley's logs, dated 1819, attributed to Micah. The shaft was not opened from above. The court ordered it left intact. By this point, the question was no longer structural, it was logistical. The total length of the passage exceeded 200 feet. Its construction required many tons of earth. Its reinforcement required planning. Its maintenance required access and concealment. Its existence required time. No record accounted for it. On 5 April 1825, the court suspended further inspection and convened a closed hearing to determine jurisdiction. The issue had exceeded insurance law. It had entered a space for which no clear statute existed. Pritchard's final entry before the hearing is brief. The passage remains as found. The closed hearing convened on April 7, 1825, in a side chamber of the 1st District Court, attended by only 4 officials, the plantation owner, and a recorder sworn to silence. No transcript survives. What exists instead are summaries entered later into the court's administrative index, written in neutral language that conceals more than it reveals. The matter under discussion was no longer the passage itself, it was authorship. The court required a human explanation that did not fracture the legal structure around it. Unauthorized construction beneath a residence implied negligence, conspiracy, or criminal concealment. Yet no free contractor had been employed, no invoices existed, no hired labor could be identified. By process of elimination, attention narrowed to those whose labor was unrecorded by wages and whose movements were regulated not by contract but by surveillance. On 9 April 1825, Micah was formally questioned. The record does not call it an interrogation. It is described as an administrative clarification. He was brought before the clerk, not the judge. No counsel was present. What is known of that session comes from 2 sources. The first is Pritchard's shorthand notes, later expanded in ink. The second is a brief memorandum written by Dr. Beauchamp the following day concerning Micah's physical condition after the questioning. Pritchard's notes record that Micah answered calmly. His responses were concise. He did not deny knowledge of the passage. He did not claim ownership of its design. He did not attribute its creation to any other individual. When asked how the passage was excavated without detection, Micah responded that the work was done over time. When asked how soil was removed, he stated that it was returned to the land. When asked how reinforcement was achieved without tools being noticed missing, he replied that what breaks is replaced. These answers were recorded without commentary. They are not followed by clarifying questions. At no point did Micah describe motive. At no point was he asked directly why the passage existed. The physician's memorandum, dated 10th April, notes that Micah exhibited signs of exhaustion but no acute injury. His pulse was described as steady, his speech coherent. There is no mention of punishment administered. What followed was a reconstruction of Micah's life, undertaken not for empathy, but for context. Plantation inventories indicate that Micah was born around 1990, likely on the same property, though no birth record exists. He appears in the earliest Holloway ledger as a child assigned to domestic errands. By his late teens, he was listed as an assistant to the plantation carpenter. A letter written by Jonathan Holloway to his brother in 1812, preserved in a private family collection, mentions the boy Micah as clever with joints and hinges. The remark is casual. It is the only personal reference to Micah in Holloway's correspondence. Following the wrist fracture in 1816, Micah was permanently reassigned from field labor. Medical notes describe the injury as improperly set before treatment, resulting in limited strength but retained dexterity. He was thereafter used for interior repairs, cellar maintenance, and tool inspection. This reassignment placed him in spaces not commonly accessed by others: under floors, behind walls, in storage areas. Over the next decade, Ridley's logs show a pattern. Micah's tasks were frequent but brief. Rarely did they occupy a full day. He was moved between assignments that required discretion and trust rather than strength. There is no record of Micah receiving punishment for absence, no note of insubordination, no attempt at escape. It is in this absence that later historians would locate significance. The passage, as measured, could not have been excavated quickly. Fournier estimated that, working alone, removal of that volume of earth would require years. The soil would have to be loosened, carried, dispersed, and compacted elsewhere without creating visible mounds or altering drainage patterns. Micah's work assignments, when charted over time, show small gaps: an hour here, 2 hours there, never enough to draw notice. The court requested an estimate from Fournier. Could a single individual working intermittently create such a passage? Fournier's response, entered into the file, is cautious. He states that it would be improbable but not impossible, given sufficient time, planning, and concealment. The question of why such an effort would be undertaken remained unanswered. One hypothesis, proposed in a marginal note by Pritchard and later crossed out, suggested escape. This was quickly discounted. The passage did not exit beyond the plantation. It terminated beneath a structure still within the property boundary. It did not lead to the river. It did not connect to any known route of flight. Another hypothesis concerned storage or contraband. No evidence supported it. The passage was empty. No caches were found. What remained was harder to formalize. The passage allowed movement beneath the house without detection. It intersected spaces of authority: dining room, study, cellar. It existed entirely within the plantation's controlled environment, yet outside its surveillance. Micah was asked whether he used the passage. He answered that he had. When asked when, he replied, "as needed." The phrase appears verbatim in the record. It is not expanded upon. On 12 April 1825, Micah was returned to his duties. No charge was filed, no punishment recorded. the court issued a provisional ruling that the passage was to be filled and sealed under supervision. The language emphasizes safety and liability. The filling began on 15 April. Earth was returned in measured layers. The reinforcement impressions were destroyed. The shaft beneath the tool shed was left untouched, but its floor was reinforced from above. Micah was assigned to assist in the sealing. This decision is recorded without explanation. Dr. Beauchamp's final note regarding Micah, dated 20 April, remarks only that he appeared unusually withdrawn. No medical cause is suggested. The court closed the matter on May 2, 1825. The ruling states that no violation of territorial law could be established. Responsibility was deemed indeterminate. The records were archived. Micah continued to appear in plantation logs until 1828. That year, his name disappears. No sale record exists. No death is recorded. The omission is unexplained. What remains are the measurements, the affidavits, and the absence of motive. The passage was filled. The house stood. The system resumed its routines. But the documents had already recorded something it could not name. That within a structure designed to enforce visibility and control, a space had existed that answered to neither. In the months following the court's closure of the case, the Holloway plantation returned, on paper, to ordinary operation. The insurer released partial payment for the foundation repair. The cellar floor was relaid. The dining room above showed no visible alteration. No notation in parish records marked the site as exceptional. Yet, within the institutional record, the matter did not disappear. It migrated. In June 1825, a brief inquiry was opened within the Territorial Office of Public Works, prompted by Fournier's affidavit. The office's mandate extended to levees, roads, and public safety. Subsurface construction beneath private residences fell outside its formal jurisdiction, but the scale and precision described in the documents warranted review. The inquiry produced no field investigation. Instead, it generated correspondence. Letters were exchanged between clerks, engineers, and legal advisors, each careful to define the limits of responsibility. The passage was private. It was sealed. It posed no ongoing risk. One letter, dated 17 July 1825, preserved in the office's miscellaneous file, notes that the incident presents no actionable defect, though it suggests a capacity for works not anticipated by current oversight mechanisms. The sentence is underlined in later hand. At the parish level, the sheriff's office briefly considered whether unauthorized excavation constituted a criminal offense. The review ended quickly. No statute addressed such activity when conducted by enslaved labor under implied authority. The absence of law is itself determinative. The system, confronted with an event that did not fit its categories, resolved the matter by classification rather than explanation. Within the plantation, however, subtle changes are detectable. Ridley's overseer logs from mid-1825 onward show an increase in recorded inspections. Tool counts become more frequent. Night patrols are noted for the first time. Access to the cellar is restricted. These measures are described as routine, yet their timing is suggestive. Micah's disappearance in 1828 becomes, in this context, more difficult to interpret. The absence of a sale record implies he was not transferred legally. The absence of a burial record suggests he did not die on the property. One later inventory, dated 1830, includes a marginal correction where Micah's name appears to have been written and then scratched out. No replacement name is added. Contemporary explanations are speculative. Some later plantation correspondence obliquely refers to loss during a flood year, though no flood of record corresponds to the timing. Others suggest informal transfer or abandonment, practices not common but rarely documented. In the decades that followed, the Holloway plantation changed hands twice. By 1854, it was subdivided. The main house remained, altered but standing. The cellar was used for storage, then abandoned. No further subsurface anomalies are recorded. It is only in the late 19th century that the case reemerges, reframed by distance and scholarship. In 1891, an article published in the Louisiana Historical Quarterly references the Holloway subsurface irregularity as an example of early engineering misattribution. The author, Charles Montreux, dismisses the notion of intentional construction, proposing instead a natural void, later shaped by human repair. His argument relies on regional sinkhole data. He does not address the measured regularity or reinforcement impressions. A rebuttal appears 2 years later, citing Fournier's affidavit and Carraway's field notes. The exchange remains polite, unresolved. By the early 20th century, the case is cited in footnotes concerning enslaved labor skills and unrecorded craftsmanship. Micah's name occasionally appears, often misspelled, stripped of context. In 1937, during a Works Progress Administration survey of historic plantations, a team attempted to locate the passage. Ground-penetrating methods were not available. Probing revealed nothing conclusive. The cellar floor had been replaced multiple times. The original reference points were lost. The effort was abandoned. Later attempts fare no better. A 1968 archaeological proposal was denied funding. A 1994 private survey reported no anomalous voids, though its methodology is not preserved. Each failure adds to the uncertainty rather than resolving it. Interpretations proliferate. Some scholars frame the passage as an act of quiet resistance, a means of reclaiming autonomy within confinement. Others caution against romanticization, noting the absence of stated motive and the risk of projecting intent where none was recorded. Psychological explanations suggest a coping mechanism, the creation of a private space as refuge. Social analyses emphasize access and opportunity afforded by Micah's role. Environmental readings point to soil conditions unusually favorable to excavation. A minority of commentators raise the possibility of assistance, unrecorded collaboration among the enslaved community. This too remains unproven. No corroborating testimony survives. What unites these interpretations is their reliance on inference. The documents themselves refuse conclusion. The legal system closed the case by declaring it indeterminate. The engineering assessments stopped at description. The historical record preserves measurements without meaning. By the time modern scholars return to the archive, the passage exists only on paper, a set of numbers, angles, and absences. The system that produced those records was designed to catalog labor, property, and compliance. It was not designed to account for sustained, concealed agency exercised without overt defiance. In that failure, the case of Micah Holloway endures, not as a solved mystery, but as a documented fact that resists reduction, surviving in the archive as a quiet challenge to the limits of institutional understanding. The last verified reference to the Holloway passage appears in an inventory compiled on 11th January 1832 during the probate proceedings following Jonathan Holloway's death. The document lists land, structures, livestock, tools, and debts. The seller is mentioned only once, described as serviceable, sealed, and of no special note. No annotation follows. From that point forward, the historical trail thins. In the mid-19th century, as plantation records were scattered by war, sale, and inheritance, the documents relating to the subsurface inspection were folded into larger archival collections. They survived not because they were valued, but because they were misfiled. Insurance correspondence was bundled with court minutes. Engineering affidavits were stitched into agricultural disputes. Pritchard's ledger escaped disposal only because its spine bore a court seal. The passage itself, having been filled and sealed, left no visible scar. Later renovations altered the cellar floor. The dining room above was refashioned in changing styles. Each modification erased another reference point. By the time emancipation arrived, the physical context of the case was already compromised. Those who might have carried memory of the passage did not leave written testimony. Their silence is not mysterious. It is consistent with the conditions under which their lives were recorded. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, scholars approached the Holloway case cautiously. They did not dispute the measurements. They did not challenge the affidavits. Instead, they questioned relevance. Without a surviving structure, without a recovered void, the case could be set aside as an anomaly. Several attempts were made to relocate the passage. Each failed. A 1904 parish survey noted irregular subsurface density, but attributed it to tree roots. A 1937 WPA team, lacking precision instruments, found only disturbed soil consistent with prior repairs. In 1968, an archaeologist proposed targeted excavation, but could not secure permission from the property owner. A 1994 private survey using early geophysical methods reported uniform compaction. Its raw data is lost. Each negative result reinforced a prevailing conclusion. Whatever had once existed no longer could be demonstrated. Yet, the documents remained. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a shift occurred in historical interpretation. Scholars began to focus less on physical recovery and more on administrative trace. The Holloway case was re-examined not as an engineering puzzle, but as a record of institutional response to unanticipated human action. What stood out was not the passage's construction, but the system's reaction to it. Courts did not deny its existence. Engineers did not dispute its measurements. Officials did not accuse Micah of deception. Instead, responsibility was declared indeterminate. Jurisdiction was blurred. The matter was closed without resolution. This pattern appears elsewhere in the historical record. When actions occurred that could not be framed as obedience, rebellion, or error, they were often absorbed into bureaucracy and rendered inert. Micah Holloway's life, insofar as it can be reconstructed, fits this pattern. He did not flee. He did not confess motive. He did not leave testimony. He answered questions precisely and stopped where the record required him to stop. Later scholars have debated whether the passage should be understood as resistance, refuge, or something else entirely. Each interpretation reveals as much about the interpreter as about the subject. The documents themselves refuse alignment. They show that sustained, complex labor occurred beyond supervision. They show that it was technically competent. They show that it was concealed in sight plain. They do not tell us why. The absence of motive is not a gap to be filled, but a condition to be acknowledged. In this sense, the passage beneath the Holloway house functions less as an object than as a boundary. It marks the limit of what the archive can explain. It reminds us that recorded history is shaped not only by what happened, but by what institutions were capable of recognizing. Micah Holloway disappears from the record in 1828. The passage disappears beneath packed earth. What remains is documentation that cannot be comfortably categorized as error or myth. It persists because it was written down by people who did not understand it, but were required to measure it anyway. In that persistence lies its significance, not as a tale of mystery and not as a story of fear, but as evidence of human capacity operating within constraint, leaving behind traces precise enough to endure, yet incomplete enough to resist closure. Some histories end with answers, others end with records. This is one of the latter. If you value carefully reconstructed histories drawn from archives, margins, and silences, and if you want to support work that documents the past without witnesses, consider subscribing to Past Without Witness.